I undressed her. Her breath was bittersweet. Her brown rose tasted of blood. She was shaking from head to toe. She complained of a painful stiffness in the upper vertebrae, and I thought of poliomyelitis as any American parent would. Giving up all hope of intercourse, I wrapped her up in a lap-robe and carried her into the car. Kind Mrs. Hayes in the meantime had alerted the local doctor. "You're lucky it happened here," she said, "for not only was Blue the best man in the district, but the Elphinstone Hospital was as modern could be, despite its limited capacity." With a heterosexual L. Koenig in pursuit, thither I drove, half blinded by a royal sunset on the lowland site, and guided by a little old woman, a portable witch, perhaps his daughter, whom Mrs. Hayes had lent me, and whom I was never to see again. Dr. Blue, whose learning, no doubt, was infinitely inferior to his reputation, assured me it was a virus infection, and when I alluded to her comparatively recent flu, curtly said that this was another bug. He had had 40 such cases on his hands, all of which sounded like the ague of the ancients. I wondered if I should mention with a casual chuckle that my 15-year-old daughter had had a minor accident while climbing an awkward fence with her boyfriend. But knowing I was drunk, I decided to withhold the information till later, if necessary. To an unsmiling blonde bitch of a secretary, I gave my daughter's age as practically 16. While I was not looking, my child was taken away from me. In vain I insisted I be allowed to spend the night on a welcome mat in the corner of that damned hospital. I ran up constructivistic flights of stairs. I tried to trace my darling so as to tell her she had better not babble, especially if she felt as light-headed as we all did. At one point I was rather dreadfully rude to a very young and very cheeky nurse with overdeveloped gluteal parts and blazing black eyes, of Basque descent, as I learned. Her father was an imported shepherd, a trainer of sheepdogs. Finally, I returned to the car, and remained in it for I do not know how many hours, hunched up in the dark, stunned by my new solitude, looking out open-mouthed, now at the dimly illuminated, very square and low hospital building squatting in the middle of its lawny block, now up at the wash of stars and the jagged silvery ramparts of the Haute Montagne, where at the moment Mary's father, lonely Joseph Law, was dreaming of Oleron, Lagore, Rolas, que sais-je, or seducing a ewe. Such like fragrant vagabond thoughts have been always a solace to me in times of unusual stress, and only when, despite liberal libations, I felt fairly numbed by the endless night, did I think of driving back to the motel. The old woman had disappeared, and I was not quite sure of my way. Wide gravel roads crisscrossed drowsy rectangular shadows. I made out what looked like the silhouette of gallows on what was probably a school playground. And in another waste-like block there rose in domed silence the pale temple of some local sect. I found the highway at last, and then the motel, where millions of so-called millers, a kind of insect, were swarming around the neon contours of no vacancy, and when, at 3 a.m., after one of those untimely hot showers which, like some mordant, only helped to fix a man's despair and weariness, I lay on her bed that smelled of chestnuts and roses and peppermint, and the very delicate, very special French perfume I latterly allowed her to use, I found myself unable to assimilate the simple fact that for the first time in 2 years I was separated from my Lolita. All at once it occurred to me that her illness was somehow the development of a theme, that it had the same taste and tone as the series of linked impressions which had puzzled and tormented me during our journey. I imagined that secret agent, or secret lover, or prankster, or hallucination, or whatever he was, prowling around the hospital. And Aurora had hardly warmed her hands, as the pickers of lavender say in the country of my birth, when I found myself trying to get into that dungeon again, knocking upon its green doors, breakfastless, stoolless, in despair. This was Tuesday. And Wednesday or Thursday, splendidly reacting like the darling she was to some serum, sparrow's sperm or dugong's dung, she was much better, and the doctor said that in a couple of days she would be skipping again. Of the 8 times I visited her, the last one alone remained sharply engraved on my mind. It had been a great feat to come, for I felt all hollowed out by the infection that by then was at work on me too. None will know the strain it was to carry that bouquet, that load of love, those books that I had travelled 60 miles to buy, Browning's dramatic works, The History of Dancing, Clowns and Columbines, the Russian Ballet, Flowers of the Rockies, the Theatre Guild Anthology, Tennis by Helen Wills, who had won the National Junior Girls Singles at the age of 15. As I was staggering up to the door of my daughter's $13-a-day private room, Mary Law, the beastly young part-time nurse who had taken an unconcealed dislike to me, emerged with a finished breakfast tray, placed it with a quick crash on the chair in the corridor, and fundament jigging, shot back into the room, probably to warn her poor little Dolores that the tyrannical father was creeping up on crepe soles with books and a bouquet. The latter I had composed of wild flowers and beautiful leaves gathered with my own gloved hands on a mountain pass at sunrise. I hardly slept at all that fateful week. Feeding my Carmencita well? Idly I glanced at the tray. On a yolk-stained plate there was a crumpled envelope. It had contained something, since one edge was torn, but there was no address on it, nothing at all, save a phony armorial design with Ponderosa Lodge in green letters. Thereupon I performed a chassé-croisé with Mary, who was in the act of bustling out again. Wonderful how fast they move and how little they do, these rumpy young nurses. She glowered at the envelope I had put back, uncrumpled. "You better not touch," she said, nodding directionally. "Could burn your fingers." Below my dignity to rejoin, all I said was, "Je croyais que c'était un bill, not un billet doux." Then, entering the sunny room to Lolita, "Bonjour, mon petit.